People often think that all existence already exists and that relationships between them form later, but in Buddhism it is said that existence is empty. So, what is in this universe? The only thing that exists is the network of dependent origination. Things appear as phenomena, but they have no substance. Everything is just arising due to information networks. This universe is calculable. The Buddha's thoughts are incredibly cold and logical. But why did Buddha go around teaching such cold things? Hello, suddenly talking about Buddhism. I'm sure some of you might think I've lost it, but I want to take the time to properly discuss Buddhism. I'm not an expert or anything, but around 15 years ago, I spent about 1 or 2 years in the library reading through almost the entire section on Buddhism. With that experience, I'll talk about the basics of Buddhism and focus on the key points that will help you understand it. I've watched a few Buddhist explanation channels on YouTube, but they tend to feel a bit too much like preaching. If you understand just the philosophical basics, you'll get what Buddhism is about. Some might dismiss it as unscientific, but that's fine. However, if you consider why scientists from modern times, even Nobel Prize-winning physicists mentioned in textbooks, have been drawn to Buddhism. If you think you see the world more scientifically than Einstein, then it's okay to dismiss Buddhism as unscientific. But if not, you might want to understand what Buddhism really is. There's no weird religious vibe here. I've selected just the essential parts from my years of reading, and I'll focus on the key points that will help you understand Buddhism. To understand Buddhism, it's important to know what the Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha, was saying, and to understand the Indian philosophy of his time. A massive body of Indian philosophy already existed, and we need to understand what Buddha rejected from it to start his new way of thinking. Buddhism started from early Buddhism and moved on to Theravada Buddhism, with monks in orange robes from Southeast Asia who were striving for enlightenment through rigorous training. Buddhism later split into 2 main branches when it came to China and Japan, where it was developed more deeply into a philosophical form. Theravada Buddhism is more focused on individual practice and achieving enlightenment, pursuing the fundamental teachings of the Buddha, while Mahayana Buddhism, which I'll be explaining, expanded these teachings to reach more people by developing it philosophically. We'll get to Buddhism later, but first, let's talk about Indian philosophy. Over 5,000 years, incredibly smart Indians who lived around 3,000 years ago, when the human brain was at its peak, created a comprehensive academic system more advanced than modern humans. They developed what's known as the Vedas, which come in many forms, and within Indian philosophy, there are fields like modern natural sciences, biology, medicine, thought, and philosophy. There was already a concept of the ultimate truth, particularly the idea of Brahman. In Sanskrit, it's called Brahman, which has a more spiritual feel and is quite popular. But rather than focusing on that, let's consider what's at the core of our self. What is the essence of I? This question of what am I is something humanity has been pondering for tens of thousands of years, even up to the present day. The conclusion reached in the vast body of Indian philosophy is the concept of Atman. Atman can be described as the smallest truth of the self. When we deeply consider what am I, we might initially think that this physical body is me, the real me, but is that really the case? If my left leg were replaced with a prosthetic, would I suddenly cease to be me? Most people wouldn't think so. There are people born without legs or without limbs at all. Even if these were replaced with machines, the essence of who they are wouldn't be lost, right? As long as we can keep the brain functioning by circulating blood, the essence of me isn't lost. Even if everything below the neck became robotic, most people would still feel that I am me. The ancient Indians thought the same way, taking it to the extreme, since it's ultimately the brain's signals that allow us to think and feel consciously. If we could extract just the brain and keep it alive, what the brain does is essentially create a neural network. When information comes in, neurons fire if they exceed a certain threshold. The brain exchanges information through electrical signals and chemical substances, essentially processing binary 0 and 1 information. This vast network of neurons allows us to think, be conscious, feel, and do various other things. If we were to extract just the brain and, for example, attach a camera lens to it, converting optical information into electronic data and feeding it to the brain, that brain would be able to see the world. Similarly, if we attached a microphone that converts air vibrations into electrical signals and input them to the brain, it would be able to hear. We could even attach a speaker to allow it to speak. In this case, if asked whether this is still me, many people might feel that it's just barely still them. But what if we took it a step further? This neural network is essentially processing digital 0 and 1 signals. In modern times, we can create AI and reproduce neural networks as computer programs. Let's say we created a program that perfectly mimics your neurons, with the same neurons firing in the same positions with the same functions. We've essentially made a complete backup of your brain on a computer. This technology is becoming quite realistic recently. So, if we created something that behaves exactly like you and put this data into a body made of protein that's identical to yours, would you consider that to be you? At this point, most people would probably say that it's not them. This becomes the boundary of what we consider to be self, the point where the essence of me is lost. So, when we strip away all the components of me, what's left at the very end? Even if we could perfectly reconstruct it in terms of data and physical substance, we'd still say, no, that's not me. Therefore, the essence of me is obviously not the physical substance, not the information in the brain, not the data, not the memories. So what is the essence of me? You could call it a soul, consciousness, or even God, but the essence of me is something that can't be expressed. It's neither physical nor information, but it definitely exists. If you think such a soul doesn't exist, then you should be able to consider an exact clone of yourself as you. And if an AI behaves just like a human, you should naturally consider it human. But humanity can't think of these as me. This implies that there must be something that exists, something like a soul, that is neither physical nor information. This is what they called Atman. Since Atman has no physical substance, there's no increase in entropy. This means there's no arrow of time either. So, if this essential self, this soul-like thing exists, how do people think about it? When they die or disappear, everyone starts wondering where this essence goes. In Indian philosophy, they had already logically deduced that all matter, though they hadn't discovered molecules or atoms yet, breaks down into smaller parts and becomes other things. The total amount of matter doesn't change. It circulates. When living things die, their materials are used by other living beings. It was logically understood that everything circulates. Since everything circulates, it's reasonable to think that the soul, or Atman, would also circulate. This is where the concept of reincarnation comes from in Indian philosophy. They thought this soul would be reborn as other living beings. This plant, materially speaking, is cellulose, but when broken down, it becomes carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It was already said in Indian philosophy that these break down and become other things, and the same would be true for the soul. That's what reincarnation means. When talking about Buddhist philosophy, concepts like impermanence or all things are transient were already clearly stated in Indian philosophy. The substance of things exists here and now as an entity, but there's no permanent entity of, say, a leaf. all things circulate as matter. They're just existing as a leaf now, temporarily, like in the flow of a river. This was already being said in Indian philosophy. So what did Buddha deny? He said that this Atman, this soul, this essence of self, doesn't exist. If you understand this, everything else makes sense. The essence of self doesn't exist. While we feel like I exist as a phenomenon, it's ultimately an illusion. When trying to explain what it actually is, we come to Mahayana Buddhist concepts like emptiness and dependent origination. The Heart Sutra, which many people know because it's often chanted, says, "Form is emptiness. Everything we see is empty." When it says everything in this world is empty, it's not quite right to translate empty as nothingness, nor is it correct to interpret it simply as vacant because of the character used. Some people say this, but I believe it clearly means empty or void. The original term, possibly referring to shunyata in Sanskrit, also means something like empty. It means that the essential things are not present. We think that existence comes first, and then relationships form between existences, but Buddhism says that existence is empty. What exists in this universe? The only thing that exists is the network of dependent origination, which comes first. In fact, this world is primarily a network, or rather, there's nothing but the network. Everything is composed solely of this dependent origination. Everything is brought into being by networks, and while it appears as a phenomenon, there is no actual substance to it. The idea that there is no substance was also stated in Indian philosophy, but when you really dig deep into it, there's still the smallest truth of self, right? This is what Descartes, in Western philosophy, also said. No matter how logically you pursue it, at the very end, the I still exists. What Buddha wanted to say was that even this Atman, this absolute smallest truth, this Atman, I, doesn't exist. It's often explained as there's nothing certain, but in fact, Indian philosophy had already concluded that only Brahman Atman was certain. Buddha wanted to deny this. That's why it's often said that Buddhism denies reincarnation. Since the essence of me that would be reincarnated doesn't exist, since the soul doesn't exist, naturally, there's no reincarnation either. The idea that everything is a network means this world is an information space, in my opinion. Of course, he didn't use the term information space, but that's what he's getting at. There's a me and there's a peach tree, but the peach tree and I, or you could say the cultivator and the cultivated, are just part of a relationship network. When the phenomenon of me experiences the phenomenon of seeing, the phenomenon of peach arises. But if the network is lost, it ceases to exist. This is easy to understand subjectively, but Buddha is saying it's also true objectively. For example, people often ask questions like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? But this kind of thinking is Western in a sense, wanting to establish existence first. We become attached to certain existences. This question arises from that psychology. In Buddhism, the question of which came first, the egg or the chicken, is irrelevant. They exist only because of the parent-child relationship, the dependent origination between them. The very act of considering which came first is nonsensical in Buddhist thought. Now, when you watch a video on your smartphone, it's easy to understand that everything appearing on the screen is just a network, just phenomena appearing due to information. I'm sure no one thinks they're actually inside that screen. This smartphone as a material object, well, glass is glass, but if we're talking about the essential body of the smartphone, it's this chip. Inside, there are a huge number of transistors. Essentially, they're semiconductors, silicon in terms of material. What these transistors do is turn electrical signals on and off. In other words, they're sending signals of 0 or 1. When a large number of these transistors are arranged, they perform massive calculations. After these massive calculations, if you look closely at this screen, you'll see many small dots arranged. In this green area, the green value might be 250, while in this area it might be 163. These dots are arranged to make it look like there's a leaf. When I move like this, it's just expressing what color each dot should be to represent the shape of this hand. It's merely calculating this data as information and outputting it to make it appear that way. This is easy to understand with a monitor. So why did I think to tap on this video? That too is because you're being made to tap by a network of information. To put it simply, it's Google's algorithm. Through the learning of Google's neural network, it's predicted that you would likely tap on this video, so it's displayed there. I think I tapped this because I wanted to watch it, but even this action of tapping is due to various karmic connections. Who you've met in your life so far, what conversations you've had, what you've studied. It's because of this network that you thought to tap on this video now. You might think there's an essence of yourself and you tapped of your own will, but what Buddha is saying is that this is just a phenomenon arising from the accumulated karmic connections. The same goes for matter. For example, if you look closely at your own body, you'll see cells. You can see up to the cellular level with a microscope. But beyond that, there are atoms that make up molecules, and electrons orbit around the atoms. Even molecular bonds are ultimately a network. Areas lacking electrons stick together tightly to form molecules. They combine as an electronic network and simply arise as matter. It's just a network. Matter is just a network, and even atoms contain neutrons and protons. We can't see any further than this. It's impossible for humans to see, but we can calculate it. There are quarks and nuclear forces at work. Everything is composed of energy interactions. So, when asked what the essence is, there really isn't anything essential. This world is an information space, calculable, and there's no soul-like thing that exists as its core or essence. There's nothing vague yet definite that exists. It's only arising due to a network of information in mutual relationships. You could say the world is calculable. It's a calculable, inorganic world. It's an extremely cold philosophy. This is Buddha's way of thinking. When AI starts to behave like humans in the future, no matter how human-like it becomes, people will insist it's not human. Why? Because they'll ultimately say that there must be a core of me somewhere, and this robot doesn't have it. But Buddha says that's not the case. The essence of me doesn't exist in the first place, and of course robots don't have an essence either. But as phenomena appearing in the same way, they are identical. It's a philosophy with a scientific sensibility. However, why did Buddha go around preaching such cold things? It's about the suffering in this world. Why do people suffer? There are many types of suffering, but when you trace the cause of all suffering, you think there must be some existence there. People think there's a solid me that exists, and that my will is at work. However, everything is just a phenomenon that appears through networks, and Buddha wanted to say that there's no need to be bound by it. All suffering is born only from being bound to something. Some people might be bound to money, others might be worried about their relationships with others. But such things are empty, they don't exist. There's only dependent origination, and phenomena appear from that. So there's no need to be attached to it. Because we're attached to the idea of me, we suffer from dying and aging, wanting to stay young. But there's no such thing as a solid me anywhere. Not just things, but beliefs, thoughts, cherished values. All of these are empty too. Mental phenomena, emotions, all of these are empty. The illusion that these non-existent things exist is the cause of all suffering. That's why Buddhism is saying, let's stop being bound by these things. Let me make an excuse, not just for Buddhism, but I learned this by reading a lot of books. However, it's said that once something is put into writing, the essence is lost, and you can't get the true essence of Buddhist teachings from written words. Buddha himself died saying, never put this into writing, but his disciples wrote it down as sutras anyway. About 3,000 years ago, when human brains were larger and people were wiser, all of them about 3,000 years ago, if you trace back the origins of natural sciences like physics, mathematics, chemistry and biology, you'll find philosophy at the root. And who's at the origin of philosophy? It's Socrates from 3,000 years ago. Socrates said, "Never write it down, because if you write it down, all the essence will be lost." But his disciples, Plato and Aristotle, started writing it down and turning it into academic study. This made it possible to explain things logically in a way anyone could understand, leading to the development of science as we know it today. But there's a possibility that the true essence has been lost. Confucius also said, "Never write it down." But after he died, his disciples wrote, "The Master said," by writing it down, people become dependent on the written words and stop thinking for themselves. They feel like they've become smarter and gained something just by installing this written information into themselves, but that's probably not the real essence. Buddha said this too. That's why we're told to learn through experience, which is why we're farming. The same goes for Christ. The New Testament wasn't written by Christ himself, but by his disciples after he died. Maybe experience is more important. If you want to detach from the secular world, why not try growing plants in nature yourself?
Bye.